So let's now make sure that clicking this plus button in this app bar here does open this modal overlay at the bottom, which then does allow us to enter new expenses. For that, of course, we have to work on this function here, which we assigned to the onPressed argument of this icon button, because that is the function that will be triggered when the button is pressed. And we could edit it here inside of this build method. So we could work right inside of this anonymous function here, or alternatively, what I will do here, we can add a new method to this underscore expenses state class. And this method here could be called open add expense overlay or anything like that. The name is of course up to you. It's a method that doesn't need to return anything, hence its return type is void. And inside of the curly braces, so between the curly braces, we're going to add the logic for showing this overlay. But before we do that, we want to assign this function as a value to onPressed by pointing at it like this, as you learned, without parentheses, since we don't want to execute the function here. Instead, we want to use it as a value for onPressed so that Flutter internally, so to say, can execute this function here whenever this button is pressed. Now, inside of open add expense overlay, I now want to execute some code that does open such an overlay. And thankfully here, we can use a built-in feature. If we type show here, we can get a long list of built-in functions that are all provided by Flutter that we can call to show built-in UI elements like a date picker or a dialog box. And we'll see some of these things, for example, the date picker, a little bit later. Now here it's actually the modal bottom sheet which we want to show. So it's show modal bottom sheet which we want to execute inside of this open add expense overlay function. And this show modal bottom sheet function here is provided by Flutter, and hence it's available because of this material Dart import, which, as you can tell by now, really unlocks many things, many widgets, and also, for example, this utility function. Now, this function will dynamically add a new UI element, such a modal overlay, when it's being executed. And since I created it here by using the suggestion whilst typing it, my code editor automatically set it up to use two named arguments, context and builder, to which we have to pass values when calling show modal bottom sheet, because these are two required arguments that must be set when using this function. Now, context here wants a build context value. For example, this context here, which we get automatically as an input to the build method, so which is passed to the build method by Flutter. Here we're outside of the build method, and yet there actually is a globally available context object, a context property, that's made available by Flutter automatically since we're in a class that extends state. When you're in a class that extends state, Flutter automatically adds a context property to your class behind the scenes, so to say. It's provided by this state parent class. And this context property that's made available by Flutter can be used as a value for this context argument that must be set on show modal bottom sheet. But for that, it's of course important to understand what this context thing is all about. And in the end, you can think of this context object, this context value, as some kind of metadata collection, an object full of metadata managed by Flutter that belongs to a specific widget. So every widget has its own context object, and that contains metadata information related to the widget and, very important, related to the widget's position in the overall UI, in the overall widget tree. So this context value which we get here holds information about this expenses widget in the end and its position in the widget tree, as you also see if you hover over this context value. Now this object, which is full of metadata, is required by show modal bottom sheet, which is why you have to pass it as a value for the context argument here. And the second argument that must be set is another builder argument. And whenever you see an argument called builder, it basically always means that you must provide a function as a value. And here it's a function that should return a widget and that automatically gets one input value passed into it by Flutter, which will call this builder function basically when it then tries to show this modal bottom sheet. So here we can set up a function which gets a context value, and here I name this context parameter ctx so that I don't clash with this context. I could use the same name, but technically it's a different context because it's the context of this modal bottom sheet that will be created. So the information object related to that instead of the information object related to the expenses widget, and hence I choose a different name here. And inside of this function body, you now have to return your widget that should basically be displayed when Flutter renders this modal bottom sheet that it's opening up. And therefore here we can again use this very short notation using this arrow syntax, since here we return that widget that should be shown. And to get something on the screen quickly, I'll again use the text widget here as a placeholder and just say modal bottom sheet, and add a semicolon at the end here, and a comma here for formatting reasons. And now this is the code that we must execute in here to show some modal bottom sheet. And of course the text widget will soon be replaced with the actual content that should be in that modal sheet. So with that, if you save everything and you click this plus button, you should now get such a modal sheet at the bottom. At the moment, just a tiny one because there isn't a lot of content in there, but there is this overlay which closes if you click on that backdrop that also opened up. You see that the background gets grayed out when this sheet at the bottom opens, and if we click on that backdrop, the sheet closes again. So that's how we can open and close it, and now of course we have to work on the content inside of that modal bottom sheet, and we also might want to add some additional configuration to it to make sure that it behaves correctly.